Bibliophiles of the internet, today I am back to share my April wrap-up. If you thought I read an interesting assortment of books in March, you would be correct, but also you are not prepared for the absolutely wild range of work I read in April. I guarantee you will not be able to predict what book or what genre is coming next. Let's dive right in, starting with the first book I finished in April, which was A Practical Guide to Dating a Demon by Hannah Reynolds. I listened to the audiobook from my library, which is read by Rachel F. Hirsch, but I was gifted a review copy courtesy of Color Pages Book Tours and Penguin Teen. This is billed as a whimsical YA romantasy story about Naomi, who is a scholarship student at magical school known as the Lyceum. While she is ultra-focused on her studies so she can maintain her scholarship, she finds herself constantly bombarded by would-be suitors who are trying to date her just so they can gain an introduction to her aunt, who is a well-connected politician. So Naomi decides to outsmart these persistent suitors by claiming to be betrothed to a demon known as Daziel. And after repeating this lie enough times, one day she comes home to find the demon Daziel lounging in her dorm room and claiming that they are in fact affianced, and that Naomi's word has created a kind of binding magic. Also worth noting, a lot of the world building in this story is inspired by and influenced by Jewish mythology, folklore, and beliefs. Content warnings for experience, prejudice, and some descriptions of injury and violence. This is a case where I enjoyed the story, I enjoyed the overall reading experience, but I wouldn't say that I love this book or that I would enthusiastically recommend it. I do think it's entertaining, it takes a really fun premise and plays out that scenario in very interesting ways. I just think it had some clear structural issues, and overall the world building could have been much more developed and robust. I do appreciate how the story provides a unique take on magic and a magic school setting, not only from its use of Jewish mythology and folklore, but also in the way that magic itself is steeped in etymology and linguistic practices. As someone who's very interested in language and the history of language, it was really satisfying to see the characters grappling with that on a very granular level and discovering how the slightest modifications in language and phrasing might fundamentally change or impact the effects of magic. I do think it's also really endearing to see the accidental domesticity blooming between Naomi and Daziel over time. It's really sweet to see their relationship evolve from reluctant forced proximity to mutual pining, and to see the push and pull of their shared attraction as the story progresses. And I do think that dynamic between them is very smartly underscored by a mysterious phenomenon destabilizing the city's magic, which is a mystery that only this delightfully mismatched interspecies couple can solve with their respective abilities and insights and magic. That said, I don't love that this book presents itself as a standalone, but is secretly angling to become possibly a duology or a longer series, as evidenced by the very jarring way the story ends. And I was also a bit let down by Daziel as a character and a love interest, because you really want to root for him, and he does prove himself to be very soft and kind and attentive, which is something you wouldn't expect from a demon, but by the end of the story, it doesn't seem like he's really changed in a meaningful way, and he conducts himself in ways that make me not want him and Naomi to get together after all, which is a very weird thing to feel about a fantasy romance. So there were ups, there were downs. I'm still glad I got the chance to read this, and like I said, a majority of the story was pretty enjoyable and entertaining. This wouldn't be the first book that comes to mind for me when recommending fantasy romances, but it still has merit and it still has something to say, so I gave it an even 3 stars. After that, I decided to do a complete 180 and listen to The Works of Vermin by Hiron Enns, and the audiobook is brilliantly performed by Max Myers. This is a weird, queer blend of horror and fantasy. It imagines a metropolis that exists entirely on the stump of an ancient tree. In its canopy, the pampered elite warp their minds with toxic perfumes, and in its roots, gangs of exterminators hunt colossal worms the size of dragons. The main character, Guy, has always lived in poverty and has no choice but to work as an exterminator, especially if it means he can keep his younger sibling out of debt. His latest quarry is a worm the size of a dragon with deadly venom and a ravenous taste for artwork. Of course, no sane person would hunt this creature if given the choice, but unfortunately for Guy, he does not have a choice. Content warnings for graphic body horror, death, injury, and violence, experienced classism, instances of police brutality, references to dead naming, brief allusions to child death, and some sexual content. This sounded like such a weird, disgusting, bizarre little book, which it absolutely is, and I had a feeling that I would vibe with it for all of those reasons, and I'm happy to report that I was absolutely correct. I think when I first heard this was a horror fantasy story, I had an idea in my head of what that would look like, but I think it's written in a really captivating, but also completely unexpected way. It very much reads like a gilded piece of historical fiction, and it's also told from 2 almost completely divorced perspectives. To be clear, there's more than just two POVs, but there are two very different halves of this fantasy world. There's a class of rich elites living in luxury and excess in the overworld, and an impoverished class of workers languishing in the underworld doing all the undesirable labor in hopes of just keeping themselves alive. So it's all one fantasy world, but this very jarring class divide makes it clear that these two classes live in almost completely different realities, and the juxtaposition between the two is not only extremely compelling, but it's also disturbing, and purposefully so. The way the upper class especially are completely divorced from reality and from the hideous underbelly of the city that makes their way of life possible to begin with is part of what makes this story so horrific. This story made me think a lot about who has the privilege of consuming art, appreciating art, experiencing beauty, and who are the ones who create art, who protect art, who give art value because of their inability to access it, who are the ones who make the conditions to create and experience art possible in the first place, and why don't those two sides of the equation ever quite balance? This is a truly stunning story in so many ways. It's deftly crafted, it's creative, it takes real artistic risk, it has twists and turns that in hindsight would make rereading the story a completely different experience. Sometimes its ambition does outweigh its execution, but that's honestly not saying much. I still gave this a solid 4 stars, and I would absolutely recommend it. Then, because April is Arab American Heritage Month, also sometimes referred to as Mina Heritage or Swana Heritage Month, I wanted to pick up at least one book written by an Arab author, so I finally read Kareem Between by Shifa Saltagi Safadi. And even though this book has been out, I read from a galley I got from Random House Kids. This is a middle grade novel in verse about a Syrian American kid named Kareem who's just trying to figure out where he fits in at school, especially after his best friend moved away, and he really messed up his tryout to make it on the middle school football team. Just when he begins to feel like all hope is lost, the hotshot quarterback promises to get Kareem another tryout for the team, but only if Kareem does the quarterback's homework in exchange. To make things worse, Kareem's mom returns to Syria to try and bring her elderly parents out of a war zone and back to the States, but a new executive order could prevent her and anyone else from the region from entering the country in the first place. Content warnings for experienced bullying, racism, Islamophobia, and xenophobia, explorations of grandparent death and grief, some descriptions of the Syrian war including unlawful arrests, surveillance, and disappearances, and some references to unlawful deportation and detainment. I thought this was really fantastic. Not only is it a thoughtful and heartfelt story, but it's a book that uses the format of verse in really smart and really effective ways. I love the way this story plays with form to really convey emotion, the way it plays with space and alignment to really create a sense of character and perspective. I especially love how the verse switches back and forth between left alignment and right alignment, depending on whether the characters are speaking English, which is read from left to right, or Arabic, which is read from right to left. So I thought that was really smart because it visually conveys a sense of cultural immersion without having to spell out that the characters are speaking or thinking in Arabic, and I just found that to be a creative and effective use of verse. I also just appreciate the overall message of the story, which is that it's okay to not know where you belong or to not know how to belong. As long as you stay true to yourself and your values, you will eventually find the right path for yourself. And there's also a lot in here about existing between two worlds, feeling like you're being forced to pick between different sides of yourself that are all true at the same time, and ultimately realizing that being more than one thing and embodying more than one experience or perspective is actually a superpower, not a weakness. And I also respect that this story is openly addressing and criticizing recent Trump administration policies regarding immigration, travel bans, and deportation, showing young audiences how these are not just words or pieces of rhetoric. They present real danger and have real consequences when it comes to people's lives. So again, overall, I really enjoyed this. I appreciate its craft, its intentionality, its messages, and I would give it a solid 4.25 stars. After that, I finally picked up Rakesfall by Vajra Chandrasekhara. I started reading it physically, but eventually checked out the audiobook from my library, which is read by Shiromi Arserio. This is a very complex, very ambitious work of science fiction, but very simply put, it's a standalone sci-fi epic about two characters, Annelid and Leverett, who are irrevocably connected to each other after meeting during the Sri Lankan Civil War. Trapped together in a demon-haunted wood, another act of violence links them together and propels their souls on a journey of reincarnation throughout the ages. Content warnings for experienced racism and colorism, references to chattel slavery, the slave trade, and other forms of colonial violence, references to alcoholic relatives, and some graphic depictions of war, blood, injury, and violence. This book was such a trip, and I'm almost entirely certain that a not insignificant portion of it went right over my head. But weirdly enough, that only made me enjoy it and appreciate it even more. I've made this comparison before, but this is one of those books that are like those optical illusion paintings where you have to get super close to the image and then let your eyes fully unfocus in order to see what's on the canvas when you pull away. That is very much the experience of this book. You can't be thinking about what came before or what might come next. You can only sit with it in the present moment, fully surrender to the story's whims, and trust that it's taking you someplace worthwhile, because it is. And even though this is an incredibly ambitious, ephemeral, high-concept story that's both hard to describe and in some ways hard to fully understand, it's also incredibly grounded in its own way and easy to parse through each individual piece, even though these different timelines and perspectives and realities make up something much more kaleidoscopic and complex. I find the project of this story to be both fascinating and compelling. By following these characters across lifetimes and realities, the story is able to explore cycles of colonial violence in really unique ways, and it's able to ask some really striking questions about what it means to seek truth and tell truth in a world that is constantly changing, in a world where history itself is neither safe nor static. It's inviting the reader to reflect on how far removed you have to become in order to no longer be complicit in the sins of your ancestors. Is such a removal even possible to begin with? Is that a goal we should even want to achieve? What responsibility do we have to understand the far-reaching echoes of our past, even as we continue relentlessly moving forward in time and space? These are all deeply important questions and ideas, and I appreciate this story for asking them and for taking serious narrative risks to engage the reader with those questions in the process. Again, can I confidently say that I understood 100% of this story and its project? No, I can't. But that's also not really the point. I'm super excited to read more from this author in the future, and in the meantime, I gave Rakesfall 4 stars. Then I was absolutely foaming at the mouth to continue the Unwritten Rules companion series, so I gave in and allowed myself to pick up Fire Season by Katie Casey. This is part of an indie series of queer baseball romances. This particular story is about a down-on-his-luck relief pitcher named Reed who is not only struggling to maintain his newly acquired sobriety, but also his roster spot. Charlie Braxton, on the other hand, is an incredible starting pitcher in the major leagues who seems to have everything you could possibly want: a wicked curveball, a beautiful wife, and the kind of money and career stability that other ball players can only dream of. But what no one knows is that he's both struggling with severe social anxiety and going through a divorce. When Reed is picked up by Charlie's team, the two strike up a quick friendship, and when Charlie finds out that Reed needs a place to stay while he waits to find out whether he's going to stay on the team long term, it seems like a no-brainer for Charlie to offer Reed the empty guest room in his house. Also worth noting, I believe both Reed and Charlie are bisexual. They're both also navigating disability and mental health. Charlie has anxiety, Reed has depressive episodes and is recovering from addiction, and in terms of representation, Reed is also Jewish. Content warnings for past experiences of alcoholism and explorations of addiction and recovery from addiction, some descriptions of sports-related injury, some experienced anti-Semitism, ableism, classism, biphobia, and homophobia, brief depictions of anxiety attacks, and explicit sexual content. I am loving this series so much. It's been a minute since a romance companion series has just brought me so much pure, unfettered joy, and I'm just really loving the process and experience of reading through these books. But putting that aside for the moment, I just continue to appreciate how this author is able to create really interesting relationship dynamics from both professional and personal perspectives. Because both of these characters are pitchers, even though they're on the same team, their performances often get compared to one another, even though their roles as a starting pitcher and a relief pitcher are very different. So there's an organic sense of professional tension paralleled with the slowly building romantic tension that, of course, is absolutely delicious. I just really love the relationship at the center of this second book. There's something so tender and vulnerable about these two characters who are navigating very heavily stigmatized experiences, whether that's divorce or recovering from addiction, and a huge part of their romantic journey is about recognizing what they can control and what they can't control, and also giving themselves permission to keep trying and keep wanting things for themselves, even if that means making more mistakes. I love that the dynamic between these two characters starts off as friendship, because that ease and that camaraderie really makes it so that their relationship feels like a soft place to land. They're both fully aware that they have their own baggage, they have their own shit they have to work through, and they're very intentional about not putting that on each other's shoulders, which is really refreshing and nice. There's so much more I could say about this, but at the end of the day, this was another really beautiful, really thoughtful romance from Katie Casey. It's all about wanting to feel like you belong somewhere, like you're worthy of love and good things in life, even if you might not be a perfect person. To say I adored it would be a grave understatement, and I gave it a very solid 4.5 stars. Then, because a certain group's comeback and world tour has reignited the K-pop flame within me, I decided to pick up I'll Love You Forever by Jia Kwan. I checked out the audiobook from my library, which is read by the author herself. This is a really incredible nonfiction book that blends elements of memoir with cultural criticism and social commentary. The author is a Korean-American writer who's exploring how K-pop and the adjacent media industries it overlaps with really shaped her experience of growing up as the child of Korean immigrants, for better and for worse. Not only is she using this book as an opportunity to do a deep dive into a few of her favorite groups and idols, but she's also excavating elements of Korean history and Korean music history to piece together how the K-pop industry as we know it has become what it is today. Content warnings for in-depth explorations of experienced fat phobia, body shaming, body dysmorphia, and verbal abuse, allusions to disordered eating habits and eating disorder diagnoses, brief references to depressive episodes, non-graphic mentions of suicide and suicidal thoughts, explorations of both internal and external homophobia, and discussions of cultural appropriation, misogynistic and sexual violence, and instances of anti-blackness. I was really impressed with this book. While this blend of memoir and cultural criticism isn't necessarily a data or studies-driven book rooted in hard anthropological or sociological research, I think it's still incredibly thoughtful, insightful, and informative. Especially in this time of rising anti-intellectualism and lack of media literacy, where we see experts and expertise being devalued, if not completely undermined and ignored, it's refreshing to read from a K-pop expert who not only has years of experience being involved in K-pop fandom, but also has a deeply personal cultural connection to K-pop and whose life has been quantifiably impacted by K-pop music. I also found this to be an incredibly well-balanced piece of nonfiction. I thought the author's personal experiences fit really organically into the larger commentary regarding the machine that is the K-pop industry, especially because the pervasive cultural influence of the industry within Korean communities, both native and diasporic, profoundly and directly influenced the author's own formation of identity and self. And most of all, I really appreciate this author's ability and willingness to grapple with the true complexity and almost paradoxical nature of fandom itself, which can be beautiful and fulfilling, but also toxic and potentially dangerous at the same time. Even though the author is able to thoughtfully contextualize the music history that paved the way for what K-pop has become and is able to express how she can find joy and meaning in K-pop, she's also not afraid to draw attention to the negative sides of the industry, whether that's the abuse and overwork of idols, the perpetuation of unsustainable or unattainable beauty standards, the reinforcement of toxic and reductive gender roles, misogyny and gender-based violence, or cultural appropriation and anti-blackness. So again, I really respect this author's approach to a topic that's both niche in its own way, while also being overwhelming in scale. She truly understands the social capital and level of cultural influence, both within Korea and beyond, that the K-pop industry really has, and she's very intentional in holding its darker sides to the light and demanding better from the industry as a fan herself. Overall, I thought this was really great. I hope we get to read more from this author on this topic and related topics in the future. There were some conclusions here and there that I thought could have used an additional citation or some more supporting evidence, but that's a very minor note. I still gave this 4.25 stars. Then for work, I got to read an e-galley of the first installment in a forthcoming chapter book series, the first book being May and Malibu, The Dream Team by Jenna Elise Johnson. The first two books are actually being released simultaneously from Little Bee Books on September 22nd. Like I said, this is a really sweet first installment in a new chapter book series that's all about a young epileptic girl named May whose family is looking into getting a service dog that can help alert her and keep her safe when a seizure is about to happen. So they're set up with this adorable service dog named Malibu who May instantly connects with, but her family takes him on a trial basis, and they'll only officially adopt Malibu if May can prove that he has all the important commands down and that he can master all the seizure alert training and responses in time for the big end of summer concert. Content warnings for some non-graphic depictions of seizures. I'm not going to give a star rating for this one because, as I said, I read it for work and I wasn't reading it for review as much as I was reading it for content and context, but I can still wholeheartedly say that this chapter book was so incredibly cute and sweet. If you know a young reader who needs more chapter books in their life, especially as a stepping stone to becoming a more confident and independent reader, I think this would be a great choice. Not only is it fun and adorable, but it's also providing some behind-the-scenes insight on disability services and accommodations that a lot of people aren't familiar with. So it's an opportunity to learn more about service animals and all that goes into training and adopting service animals, but there's also a lot in here about environmental awareness, how to lessen or avoid potential triggers, and what all goes into making a truly accessible and safe space. The main character, May, also has a really supportive family and friend group, which is really lovely to see. They're all invested in helping her make this new connection with Malibu be as successful as it can possibly be, and it's refreshing that she doesn't have to explain herself or feel ashamed about her disability because everyone already knows that it's part of who she is. So again, I'm not going to give a star rating for this one, but I did really enjoy it. If you have young readers in your life, this is the start of what seems like a really fun and endearing chapter book series, and it's one that I would happily recommend. Then I realized I had another arc written by an Arab author that I was really wanting to read anyways, so I picked up A Prince Among Pirates by Katie Abdo, coming out from Simon Teen on June 16th. This is a queer YA historical adventure about a young noble named Kit Davenport who's something of a rogue and a rake. He's used to making trouble in his attempts to avoid following in his father's footsteps and serving in the House of Lords. But his days as a privileged, carefree noble are about to come to an end as his father has arranged for a suitable marriage and the wedding is slowly but surely approaching. And in fact, the night before he is about to be wed, Kit steals away in the night and buys passage on the very first ship he finds. Little does he know he may have just accidentally signed himself up to be the newest crew member aboard a pirate ship known as the Deliverance, and now for the first time in his life he'll have to take orders from and answer to someone else, namely the devilishly handsome Captain Sharp, who is not afraid to put Kit in his place regardless of his title and his rank. Also worth noting, Kit is mixed race, with one parent being from an Arabic region and the other being white, and I believe Captain Sharp is of Caribbean descent. Content warnings for references to parent death and grief, allusions to experienced racism and colorism, brief mentions of suicidal thoughts, some allusions to infidelity, some graphic depictions of death, injury, and violence, and brief instances of harassment and physical assault. This was easily one of my favorite books I read all month. It's heavily Our Flag Means Death coded, so if you also love that show and wish there were YA books that felt exactly like it, you will most likely enjoy this. It also very much feels like something Kat Sebastian would write if she wrote YA, but for a more age-appropriate comparison, I would say this is like if Aaron Cotter was crossed with F.T. Lukens. It's funny, it's wacky, it's highly entertaining, it's super queer, there's a great romantic subplot, and it's just wildly adventurous. Kit is the textbook definition of a gentleman pirate in every imaginable way. His character arc and character growth is really satisfying and endearing to witness because he definitely does start off as this haughty, entitled noble with no idea of how the world really works, but once he's escaped the confines of nobility and high society, he's able to question and discover who he truly is. I think that haughtiness is a big part of why the romantic dynamic between Kit and Captain Sharp really works, because not only are they playful and flirtatious with each other, and not only is Captain Sharp unafraid to push Kit outside of his comfort zone, but in terms of power, they're actually a pretty equal match. Sharp is every bit the intense, intimidating pirate captain who unquestionably has the final say on anything and everything that happens on his ship, but Kit is also someone who is used to flaunting his social status and being protected by that status. So even though he ultimately respects the captain's authority, he's also not afraid to push back. In my opinion, that creates some really interesting dynamics and scenarios, and it really underscores how both characters grow and change by the end of the book. So again, this book had me laughing out loud, it had me kicking my feet, it's extremely entertaining and takes the main character on a deeply fulfilling journey of growth. And thematically, I really appreciate what it has to say about knowing your worth, believing in your ability to forge your own path, and not only opening yourself up to love, but holding on to that love once you've found it and promising to never settle for anything less. I thought this was a really strong debut, and I hope that Katie Abdo writes even more queer historical fiction in the future. There were some minor pacing issues, and there were moments I thought this could have benefited from a dual POV, but neither of those things were deal breakers. I gave this 4.25 stars. Then I guess because I just couldn't get enough of gays on ships, I decided to pick up my galley of Ship Happens by Mason Deaver, which is coming out from Avon on August 18th. This is Mason's second adult romance. It's also a T for T romance about two binary trans men, Owen and Jacob, who were happily in a long-term relationship until Jacob's career as a marine biologist took him out of the country when he received an offer to spearhead a really important research expedition. So obviously he couldn't pass up that opportunity, and because neither of them were willing to do long distance, they ended up breaking up, even though they didn't really want to. Fast forward a year, and the two of them are unceremoniously reunited when their friend group is celebrating Christmas. As if that wasn't awkward enough, Owen's best friend, who also happens to be Jacob's sister, announces that she and her wife have bought the entire friend group tickets for a 6-day, 7-night Alaskan cruise, which means Owen and Jacob will essentially be trapped together on a cruise ship with nowhere to run from their unresolved feelings. Worth noting, as I said, both Owen and Jacob are trans men who have undergone medical transition, and Owen also has chronic pain and occasionally uses medicine and mobility aids to help with his arthritis. Content warnings for references to experienced ableism and transphobia, depictions of family estrangement, depictions of chronic pain, brief references to past depressive episodes and non-graphic suicidal thoughts, and some explicit sexual content. I've said it before, but I will happily say it again. I love what Mason Deaver is doing in the adult romance space. Not only are they giving us high-quality romances featuring trans characters, but they're able to deliver these really fun, tropey romances that are also doing so much more emotional work than just celebrating and centering queer romance. What I mean by that is that both of their adult romances so far are not only driven by those expected romantic beats, but are also exploring important questions about what it means for queer and trans adults specifically to navigate romantic relationships with all their idiosyncrasies and expectations. While the Build a Boyfriend project really spoke to the isolation that many queer adults experience, especially when coming into their queerness later in life, Ship Happens is more so about navigating how queer adulthood and queer relationships, romantic or otherwise, often exist outside of what we call allocis heterotemporality and exist beyond the boundaries of dominant social systems, structures, patterns, and timelines. I really appreciate how the story shows Owen feeling like he's being left behind or that there's something missing from or unfulfilling about his life, because as a single trans man, he's not meeting the same emotional and social milestones that his friends and loved ones are experiencing, nor does he necessarily want to. Everyone around him is getting married, having babies, buying houses, and meanwhile he's still catching up with the phenomenon of just getting to live life as himself and getting to experience a version of adulthood that he never could have imagined he would get to experience. I think that's a really important facet of trans adulthood that a lot of people don't understand. Our timelines exist outside of the social norm, often because we're living through futures we may not have actually envisioned for ourselves. And while other people might have had time and space to plan for all those aforementioned milestones, oftentimes our energy and thought is just focused on existing. Period. So I really appreciate the story giving those ideas weight and dignity and space, but I also appreciate how it's a very different, refreshing take on a second chance romance. There's very much a slow-burning, delayed sense of gratification when it comes to the romance, because the story really gives both characters time to interrogate what they actually want out of this reconnection, whether that's finding some sense of closure, becoming friends, or reigniting their romantic relationship. And I really respect how they're intentionally not rushing themselves to find those answers. The story really gives the characters space to ask themselves hard questions about what went wrong in their relationship, what role they might have played in those failures, what they could have done better, but also what they couldn't have changed even if they wanted to, and whether they want to put their hearts back on the line even knowing that things could always fall apart again at any moment. It's really powerful to see these two characters being comfortable in exploring those questions according to their own timeline, not allowing themselves to be pressured or limited by other people's expectations, and realizing that the only people they owe an explanation to in regards to the nature of their relationship is to each other and to themselves. So even though this is a delightfully tropey second chance romance that plays with forced proximity, awkward situations that are only heightened by obvious mutual attraction, and all the other fun places you would expect a second chance romance to go, the amount of thoughtfulness and purposefulness the characters put into rebuilding their relationship only makes the inevitable reunion between them that much more sweet. I had so much fun with this book every time I picked it up. It never failed to make me smile, and while I do wish some of these supporting characters could have been more developed and had more page time, overall this was fantastic, and I would give it a very strong 4.5 stars. Penultimately, I picked up my Patreon pick for the month, and for April, my patrons wanted me to read To Ride a Rising Storm by Monocle Blackgoose. I was kindly gifted a finished copy from Del Rey, but I listened to the audiobook that I pre-ordered myself, and that was read by Charlie Flight. This is the highly anticipated sequel to Shape a Dragon's Breath. It is an indigenous alternate history fantasy story about a young indigenous woman named Anakus, who is the first person from her small island nation to bond with a dragon in generations. Unfortunately, the English conquerors catch wind of this dragon and take it upon themselves to inform her that if the dragon is not quote-unquote properly trained by English standards, then her dragon could be taken from her and killed. So against her better judgment, she finds herself enrolled in this English dragon training academy where she has to learn how to train her dragon, Kasakwa, while not losing hold of herself, her beliefs, and her people's traditions. Also worth noting, Anakus is canonically queer, attracted to multiple genders, and actively pursuing a poly relationship. Content warnings for explorations of colonization, surveillance, racism, and classism, some experienced ableism and queerphobia, brief allusions to animal death, and some descriptions of death, genocide, war, and violence. I had been eagerly awaiting this sequel from the very moment I finished To Shape a Dragon's Breath, and in my humble opinion, this second installment did not disappoint. It both replicates and expands upon everything the first book did so incredibly well, while also taking the story to new and exciting places. Something I really loved about the first book that we see here again in the second book is the story's ability to be delightfully and surprisingly slice of life, not only because it's enjoyable to read and makes it easy for the reader to feel grounded from scene to scene, but because it's resisting the dominant forms of style, structure, and pacing that we often see in Western narratives. As you might be able to tell, this is a deeply anti-colonial series, and I love that its commitment to being decolonial and decentering colonial ways of thinking and being extend beyond just the series' thematic work and into the way the story is told itself. Again, much like the first book, the sequel is very much a character-driven story. While there is a lot happening politically and outwardly, it's the characters, their relationships, and their dynamics that propel the story forward and give the story its purpose. I love how the series gives us a refreshing take on a magic school setting, especially in the sense that it understands that one of the main functions of schooling is socialization and learning about yourself by learning about other people and lived experiences that are different from your own. But at the same time, even as Anakus is learning about how her peers live and see the world in such a different way than her own people, she never gives into hierarchical thinking or loses sight of who she is and what she believes in. She's an incredibly grounded character in that sense. With that said, I do appreciate how the sequel complicates that aspect of her character, because while it is admirable that she knows exactly who she is, that she's comfortable with herself, and that she's not afraid to speak up for herself or speak out when something feels unjust, she's also having to confront that being able to take those risks in the first place is a privilege that not everyone has. So I thought that was a really interesting wrinkle in the series, as well as an opportunity for her to really reflect on how she uses that power and that privilege. And I also appreciate the continued message about how there's so many different forms of knowledge and learning besides just the kinds that are respected, acknowledged, revered, and sanctified by powerful systems. I do think the overall world building could have been stronger. I think some of the rising political conflicts could have been introduced earlier in the story and explained better. There were also some info dumpy sequences where the reader is forced to take in a bunch of information by way of sitting through some of Anakus's lessons that felt a bit overwhelming and hard to engage with. So not a perfectly executed sequel in my opinion, but still incredibly strong. I gave this 4 stars. Lastly, for April, and coincidentally very appropriate as we got closer to May Day at the end of the month, I listened to Blood in the Machine by Brian Merchant, and the audiobook is read by Eric Jason Martin. I picked this up off the recommendation of Nathan from Schizophrenic Reads. It's a nonfiction history book following the first anti-machine revolution in the 19th century, organized by a group of rebels known as the Luddites, who took up literal arms against the industrialists who were automating their work. The Luddites organized guerrilla raids, destroyed and dismantled machines, and embarked on full-scale assaults against wealthy machine owners in order to protect their jobs, their skills, their communities, and their livelihoods. In this book, the author is tracing the long legacy of worker uprisings, especially to contextualize the ongoing class wars, and showing how these revolutions in 19th century England have a direct connection to the ways tech companies are continuing to prioritize automation and efficiency over human labor and human well-being as we live through what is known as the second machine age. Content warnings for graphic depictions of child abuse and child labor, dangerous working conditions, death, injury, illness, murder, suicide, and violence, some references to police brutality, confinement, executions, and slavery, explorations of classism, and some non-graphic mentions of misogyny, rape, and sexual assault. I read this, and Nathan recommended this because this past month there was actually a case of warehouse arson here in Southern California that made national headlines. And of course, it made headlines for all the wrong reasons, and the big media corporations entirely missed the point. The primary outrage and discourse surrounding that incident was concern for the value of the warehouse and the product that was destroyed, rather than what drove this employee to commit arson in the first place, which was horrible pay and horrible working conditions. So this book was not only extremely enlightening and invaluable in contextualizing that act of rebellion as one incident in a long and storied legacy of anti-tech, anti-corporation, pro-worker movements, but it also taught me so much more about the Industrial Revolution than I've ever learned in any history class. There's something really powerful and maybe even strangely comforting about seeing how the struggle to hold on to our humanity and to center human value in the ever changing labor marketplace has long been the concern of free thinking humans across centuries, and our generation is just the next stepping stone in that same fight. Whether people are smashing automated weaving machines or burning down a corporate warehouse, the ultimate goal of championing the laborer over the products of labor is the same, and the tools and methods of dissent we have access to remain largely unchanged. This history book is very ambitious in scope, sharing a detailed history of the Luddite Rebellion and also connecting that to modern day tech giants, the forced incorporation of AI across industries, the black box nature of the gig economy, and so much more. And I think it very successfully, clearly, and powerfully connects those dots. I think we often fall into the temptation to get swept up in recency bias and fall prey to this narrative that we're living through quote unquote unprecedented times, because if we feel like the issues we're facing have never been dealt with before, then it's easier to allow ourselves to feel overwhelmed, immobilized, and helpless. But when we understand the history that has brought us to this current moment, we can see that there is actually an imprint and there are ways for us to resist. I also just appreciate how this book explains that Luddism never was about fearing technology or being against technological advancements. It was about being against forms of technology that disadvantage the human being, while also recognizing when technology only exists to benefit the elite and not the people doing the labor itself. Luddism was about taking action when technology degraded or destabilized workers and their communities at large. So the takeaway here isn't that we should be against technology or change or evolution, but rather how we should be asking questions about how technology changes and impacts the world, who technology benefits, whether the wealth that technology accrues is disseminated equally, and whether we get a say in how technological innovation impacts our lives. There's so much more here that I could talk about. There's so much great information in this book that can and should be discussed at length, but suffice to say, I thought this was a really incredible excavation of history and insightful in the way it maps that history onto our current economical, technological, and political landscape. I do think it was maybe slightly overly long, but I would still give it a huge 4.75 stars. So there you have it. Those are all the books I read in April. As always, if you read any of them yourself, or if you plan to, or if you just want to share your favorite book that you've read recently, I would love to hear all your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.